Pregnant, dumped, and already hunting a richer father? No, Diane, Nathan's the one begging Marcus for money.
He took his mistress to dinner, then saw his pregnant ex with a billionaire CEO. "You are looking at her like you miss her," Diane said, and she did not sound worried at all. "You should try to remember why you didn't." Nathan Prescott was the kind of man. For 3 years, he built a life alongside Serena Cole, a woman who asked for very little and gave back considerably more than he ever noticed. When she stopped fitting the picture he had of his future, he let her go. What he did not know was that Serena had never been who he assumed she was, what he was about to, and the woman carrying his child was at the center of all of it. Chapter 1. The table he cannot look away. From here is what Nathan Prescott told himself on the drive uptown that Tuesday evening in November. He told himself he was doing fine. He told himself that 3 months was more than enough time, that the decision he had made about Serena was. He told himself these things with the focused, almost physical effort of a man who has spent his entire career learning to believe his own presentations, and who has gotten so good at it that the line between Nathan was 34 years old and a junior partner at Granite Partners, a private equity firm with offices on Park Avenue and a reputation for closing the deals that other firms stepped. He was good at his job in the specific way. He watched how people entered rooms. He noticed what they wore and what they drove and what the gap between those two things communicated about where they actually stood versus where they were trying to be seen. He had been doing this since he was 9 years old. It had made him a very effective dealmaker and a deeply. Diane Voss was exactly the kind of woman who made sense on paper. She was 32, worked in corporate communications for a financial group whose clients included 2 hedge funds and a government relations firm downtown. And she carried her ambition the way people who have always had permission to. She was striking in a way that registered across a room, which Diane had appeared at exactly the moment he needed to believe he had made a good decision, and he had accepted that convenience without examining what was underneath it. Aurelius was not the kind of restaurant you called the same week. Nathan had reached out to a contact who knew the general manager, and the table they gave him was good. Diane talked about a client dinner that had gone sideways in a mildly funny way, and he laughed at the right places and felt genuinely comfortable for the first time all day. Then he walked her through the Fortress Group meeting he had coming up Friday. Fortress was the deal he had spent the better part of 18 months building toward. Mid-market. If the acquisition closed before the end of the fiscal year, it would be the largest deal Granite Partners had executed in 4 years, and it would move Nathan from junior partner to something more. He had said the phrase "it needs to close cleanly" so many times to so many people that it had stopped sounding like a strategy and started sounding like a prayer. He was. It took him a full second to understand what he was looking at, the way the brain sometimes creates a delay when it encounters something it was not prepared for. Serena, 8 months pregnant, wearing a dark green wrap dress, her hair down the way she wore it on ordinary evenings at home, which was, also, he had always known without ever saying so, not a social laugh, the kind you produce for the benefit of the room. The kind that starts somewhere in the chest and comes out without effort, the kind you cannot manufacture. Nathan had not made her laugh like that in a very long time. He looked at his menu. He kept his. The man she was with was older, late 50s, was Nathan's red, silver-haired, with the kind of build that belongs to someone who had been genuinely athletic at some point and retained enough that the description still applied. He was wearing a dark suit without a tie, and wore it with the ease of a man who has long since stopped thinking about what his clothes are communicating. And Serena was leaning toward him too, in the small, unconscious way that the body moves toward things it wants. Between sentences, she reached across and touched the back of his hand, a brief proprietary gesture, the kind that does not exist between people who are learning each other. The man looked down at her hand and then back at her face, and something moved in his. He was something else entirely. She did not look toward Nathan once. Not once in the 40 minutes they sat there. The restaurant was not large. She would have seen him if she had glanced. She never glanced. He became aware that Diane had been watching him watch. You are looking at her like you miss her. Diane, you should try to remember why you didn't. I am not looking at anyone, Nathan said, which was so obviously false that producing the words made the situation worse rather than better. Diane looked at him the way a person looks at an argument they know is wrong and have decided not to bother. Then she changed the subject and did not return to it. Nathan did not allow himself to look at Serena again for the rest of the meal. He enforced this the way you enforce something you should not have to enforce, with continuous low-level effort. What he did instead was pull up the 3 years it did hurt, but not in the way he had expected, not like grief. It hurt like the specific, unwelcome feeling of realizing you have misjudged something important and cannot clearly reconstruct when or where the misjudgment began. Serena Cole had been, for 3 years, the most consistent presence in his adult life. She was 30 years old when she cooked on Sunday afternoons, unhurriedly, with the kind of focus that is its own form of rest. She read physical books, actual paperbacks stacked on her nightstand with bookmarks at various angles. She had a dry, precise sense of humor that arrived before you recognized it was coming, and once you caught it, you could. She talked about things she had noticed, and ideas that had caught her attention, and why a specific scene in a film was edited a particular way, and what that choice revealed about the character. He had loved those conversations once. He remembered that now. He had genuinely loved them, early on, in the way you love things when you are paying attention, before the habit of. Her quietness as absence of substance, her refusal to compete with the people around him as evidence that she was not in the game. He had built a story about her, piece by piece, that made his eventual decision feel like the conclusion of a logical process rather than what it actually was, which it had always been there. Tucked between a row of books and the 2 small plants she kept on the 3rd shelf, a silver frame. Nothing large. 2 people outdoors somewhere warm, both of them mid-law. Serena and an older man with silver hair. He had assumed father or family friend, the kind of photograph that it had never occurred to him was beginning to feel like a piece of information about himself. He was not eager to examine directly. They left Aurelius a little after 9. Nathan paid without reviewing the bill, which was a thing he only did when his attention was elsewhere entirely. On the street, Diane suggested a cab and "You okay?" Diane asked. "Long week," he said. She looked at her phone. He looked at his. He searched Atlas Group New York because that name had floated on the periphery of his professional life for the past year, mentioned in 2 separate conversations about. The search results loaded immediately. Atlas Group, private investment conglomerate. The founder, a photograph from a Forbes feature dated 3 years prior. Silver-haired, late 50s. The same man Nathan had been watching across a restaurant for the better part of an hour. He read the full profile, twice. Marcus Reed had taken a regional infrastructure fund and spent 20 years. He did not accept cold outreach. His office was notoriously difficult to reach. He had given 2 interviews in the past 5 years, both brief, both notable primarily for the number of things he declined to address. His name appeared in SEC filings and in the middle paragraphs of deal announcements and in the working vocabulary of people who, 3 months ago, he had ended a 4-year relationship with a woman he had decided was going nowhere. She was, at this moment, finishing dinner at one of the better restaurants in Manhattan with a man whose net worth started where most careers ended, and in 40 minutes of sitting 20 feet, he said good night to Diane with the careful lightness of a person performing normality at which nothing is normal. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold. That cold has a particular quality in New York, a sharpness that strips things down to their actual size. He stood in it and tried to remember. Specifically, what? He could not get back to it cleanly. What came back instead was her face, the way she had listened without interrupting, the long, quiet moment that followed, and then the single word she had used, which was just okay, not a, just that word, delivered without drama or collapse. And then a practical question about whether he wanted to collect his things that night or come back for them another time. He had read that composure as indifference. He understood it differently now. Standing on a cold sidewalk in the middle of the night, he had been looking at a woman who had already made her peace with what was coming, who had already, 3 days after the restaurant, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, Nathan stood outside Serena's building in the West Village and told himself, one more time, that this was about the. He had been telling himself this since Tuesday night. He told himself on Wednesday morning when he could not get through a single meeting without his mind drifting. He told himself Thursday at 7:30 when he told his assistant to hold his 10 o'clock that he had something to handle and got in a cab heading downtown. The building was a 4-story walk-up on a tree-lined block, the kind of block that looks like it belongs in a different and quieter city, which was something he had always liked about. He had spent a lot of time in this building over the past 3. He was going to be reasonable. He was going to make clear that he wanted to be involved, that he understood he had made a decision that had consequences for more than himself, and that he was ready to have an adult conversation about what he had managed entire acquisition negotiations from. She was wearing a gray wool sweater and dark pants. Her hair pulled up the way she wore it when she was working on something and wanted it out of her face. 8 months pregnant and entirely unhurried, she looked at him without surprise, without flinching, without any of the expressions he had been preparing for. She simply looked at him, the way you look at the books on the shelves, arranged without system, but somehow finding their own order. The 2 small plants on the 3rd shelf, the silver-framed photograph, and something on the kitchen table that had not been there in the same way before. A laptop open to a spreadsheet, a legal pad beside it, underneath it. 2 columns of notes dense with numbers and names and arrows connecting things. He glanced at it, and she did not offer an explanation, and he did not ask for one, which was the same failure repeating itself in a smaller register. T, she said. It was not quite a question. Sure, he said. She moved to the. He looked at it anyway. The numbers in the left column looked like revenue projections. The names in the right column looked like clients. She brought 2 mugs to the table and sat down across from him. The morning light through the kitchen window fell across the table between them and made everything look very clear and very specific. And Nathan had. He wanted to be involved. He understood that the circumstances were complicated and that he bore responsibility for that. He thought they should talk about a parenting arrangement before the baby arrived rather than after, and he had spoken to a lawyer, not to create conflict, but to understand what the options were so they could. Serena listened. She held her mug in both. I already have a lawyer, she said. You will hear from her by the end of the week. She will have a proposal for a co-parenting structure that I think is fair. I do not want to do this through lawyers, Nathan said. Serena looked at him across the table with an, that is what you said about everything, she said. You said you wanted to talk. You said you wanted to work things out without making it complicated. and then complicated is exactly what you made it, every single time. Once you had gotten what you actually needed from, it will be cleaner for both of us, and cleaner is what is best for the baby. He did not have a prepared response for that, because his preparation had assumed a different version of this conversation, one in which she was less certain and he was better. He tried a different angle. He asked how she was doing. He asked whether she had everything she needed. I am doing very well, Serena said, and the straightforward truth of it was somehow the most disarming thing she had said, and she was. He could see it. She did not have the look of a woman who had been struggling through something alone. She had the look of a woman who had been busy, genuinely and purposefully busy, with things that mattered to her, and he did not have leverage. He had never had leverage. He had simply believed he did, for long enough that the belief had calcified into assumption. He asked about Marcus. Not directly, at first, he said. I saw you the other night, at Aurelius. He paused, and then asked directly, who was the man you were with? Serena looked at him without any particular change in expression. Someone important to me, she said. Are you together? She looked at him steadily. Yes, he sat with that. He asked, how long? Long enough, she said, which was almost exactly what Marcus. He turned his head toward the bookshelf, toward the silver frame he had been peripherally aware of since he walked in. That photograph, he said. Is that him? Serena glanced at the photograph and then back at her mug. Yes, she said. That is him. It was the first full. She was not hiding Marcus Reed. She was simply not offering him to Nathan as a subject for examination. The photograph had always been there. Nathan had never asked. Now he had, and she had answered, and that was the end of it. He realized, sitting in her kitchen with the morning light. He had spent 3 years accepting what she offered and understanding it to be the whole picture. He had never considered that a person can offer a great deal and still be keeping something that is entirely her own. He did not ask anything else. He finished his tea. She said she appreciated that and meant none of it as warmth. He left, standing on the sidewalk, coat collar up against the cold. He had nothing he had gone for. He had not gotten footing with Serena. He had not found a pressure point. He had sat at her. One sentence she had said followed him down the block and into the cab. She had said it after he told her he did not want things to get complicated, and she had said it without heat, which was the thing that made it land. You were never really here, Nathan, not in the way it counted. You were present. That evening he got home to find Diane on the phone in the kitchen. She had her back to the door and did not hear him come in, and for about 4 seconds before she turned around. He saw the specific posture of a person in a conversation they are not expecting to, shoulders slightly forward, voice low, the hand holding the phone pressed close against her ear. She turned. Long day, she said. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. Something like that. She made dinner, and they ate, and she was warm and easy, and entirely the version of herself he knew, and there was nothing he could identify as wrong. Later, while he was at his desk, going through the preliminary documents for the Fortress meeting, she came and stood in the. She nodded and said she was asking because she had a client event that week and wanted to make sure the schedule would not overlap. He accepted that explanation because it was an explanation that fit. He did not notice that she had not mentioned the client event before that moment, or that the question was somewhat more specific than the overlap concern would have required. He was. This was the first time Diane extracted something useful from him. It would not be the last. He did not know any of that yet. Across the city, in a West Village apartment, with books on the shelves and plants on the 3rd shelf, and a laptop still open on the kitchen table, Serena Cole stood at her window for a moment after she stood there with her hand. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. It connected on the second ring. He came by, she said. A pause, then, in a low, measured voice that carried more concern than it announced, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. He wanted to talk about. "He knows we are together." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "That you are important to me. That yes, we are together." A brief pause on the line. And how did he take that? The way he takes most things he was not prepared for, she said. Quietly, she glanced at He is going to start pulling on threads. I know. She moved away from the window. He is analytical, and he is thorough when something costs him sleep, and this is costing him sleep. He will find the professional connection eventually, when he does. She stood in the apartment for a moment. In the quiet that follows a conversation that has gone the way you needed it to. Then she sat back down at the kitchen table, pulled the legal pad toward her, and went back to work. Chapter 3. The Deal That Bleeds. 2 weeks later, Nathan Prescott was the best version of. He had arrived at Granite Partners at 7:15, which was 45 minutes before anyone else on his floor, and he had worked through the Fortress Group acquisition documents with the focused, almost physical. The preliminary valuation model was clean. The debt structure was defensible. The management team presentations had come together over the weekend into something Nathan would have been confident presenting to. By 10:30, he was no longer the best version of himself. His contact at Fortress Group was a man named Kevin Marsh, a VP of corporate development who had been Nathan's primary relationship there for the better part of a year. Kevin was careful and methodical and not inclined to alarmism, which was why Nathan noticed the particular quality. "We received a competing proposal last week," Kevin said, "from Harland Capital, and there are some assumptions in their model that are." He paused here, in the way of someone choosing language precisely, very specific. Specific in a way that would require either a remarkable coincidence of analysis or access to information that should. "I am telling you there is an overlap that needs an explanation," Kevin said carefully. "We are not withdrawing from the process, but we need you to understand the position we are in. If there is a question about the integrity of your process, it becomes a question about thee." He said he would address it and come back to Kevin within 48 hours. He ended the call and sat at his desk for a moment with the specific stillness of a man whose floor has just changed elevation without warning. Then he started working the problem. He did it the way he did everything, methodically and from the inside out. He called a meeting. He asked about document handling. He asked who had access to the working model and at what stages. He reviewed the document management logs himself, sitting in the server room with the IT director, going through every access event on the Fortress files for the past 6 weeks. He found nothing irregular. He spent 2 days on this. He turned it over from every angle he could find and came up with nothing definitive. His leading theory, weak as it was, pointed to a junior analyst named Derek, who had left the firm 6 weeks prior for a boutique outfit with looser ethics. The timing could be made to fit if you. He went back to Kevin Marsh with this version of events anyway, because it was what he had and the clock was running. The professional pressure worked on him the way it always did, which was to make everything outside the problem feel slightly unreal. He worked later. Diane adapted to this with smooth, perfectly calibrated ease. She did not take his distraction personally. He was grateful for that, in the specific, unexamined way that you are grateful for something that appears exactly when and how you need it. He did not ask himself why her support was always so precisely timed. On Thursday of that second week, with the Fortress deal still uncertain and the leak unresolved and Friday's meeting looming, Nathan did the thing he always, working on it the way he worked on term sheets, assembling something comprehensive and airtight. It was 43 pages. It addressed custody scheduling across the first 5 years, holiday rotations through 2030, the framework for educational decisions. It communicated, in every line and subclause, that Nathan Prescott had approached fatherhood exactly as he approached everything else, as a process to be managed, an outcome to be. He sent it because he needed to control something. He understood that even as he did it, Serena's attorney, Patricia Walsh, called her the same afternoon the proposal arrived, and the question is how you want to respond and on what timeline. Hold it for now, Serena said, not because I want to delay. I want to see how the next few weeks develop before we formalize anything. Patricia did not ask why. Good attorneys understand when a client has information they are not yet. She had a 3 o'clock call with a new client and a 4:30 with the designer who was building out the Meridian Blue visual identity. She had also, 2 weeks prior, signed the lease on a Chelsea office space she would move into in January. She was not sitting still. She had not been sitting still for a very long time. Marcus arrived that evening with takeout. This was his 6th or 7th time at the apartment, enough times that he knew where she kept the mugs and that the window above the kitchen sink stuck unless you lifted while you pushed. They ate at the kitchen table. The Meridian Blue business plan was there, as it always was, after. He turned pages slowly and made no comment for several minutes, which was the reading of someone who is actually reading rather than demonstrating that they are. The positioning in the 3rd section, he said, without looking up. You are selling this as a service when it is actually a methodology. Those are. How do you mean? She said. A service can be compared and discounted. A methodology is proprietary. You built something specific here that does not exist in quite this form elsewhere. The language in the 3rd section does not reflect that yet. It sounds like every other. She pulled the legal pad toward her and wrote it down. That is going to cost me the entire positioning section, she said. Good cost, he said, and turned the page. They talked about it for 20 minutes, not in the way of a supportive partner encouraging a project, but in the way of two people who are both genuinely interested in the same problem. And she had built Meridian Blue from the ground up, and she spoke from that. The conversation produced 2 ideas neither of them had walked in with. After a while, she said, "You are reading the whole thing." "I am," he said. "You do not have to." He looked up at her then, with the expression of "I want to," he said. She picked up her mug. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did, indifferent and continuous. She had been alone in this apartment for most of the past 3 years, in the particular way you are alone when the person you are with does not quite reach you, and she had gotten so used to that solitude that he asked with the same directness he brought to everything. Not in the way of a man managing a situation, but in the way of a man who actually wants to know. "What do you want from me?" he said, "when the baby comes. Tell me what you actually want, not what you think is reasonable to." "I want Clara to have 2 parents who can be decent to each other," she said. She had not said the name out loud to anyone yet, but it came out naturally, the way things do when you have been carrying them long enough. Marcus looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Clara June," she said, "after my father's middle name." He nodded slowly, and she could see him. "I want her to see what it looks like when someone stays," Serena said. "That is what I want most, not the logistics, not the legal structure, the staying." He held her gaze for a long moment across the kitchen table, and the city was quiet outside, and there was no. He said it the way he said everything, which was plainly and without theater. The way you state a fact about the world you inhabit rather than a promise about the future. Because for him, the distinction she understood, hearing it, that she was being told the most important thing anyone had told her in years, not because it was elaborate, because it was simply true and he was simply saying it. She Someone who says the actual thing. She had not found that before. She had found it now. Nathan, meanwhile, did not know about any of this. He went into the weekend not knowing that Saturday evening, while he was at a dinner with Diane and another couple, something was happening in his physical documents, the revised Fortress valuation model, and an internal memo outlining the competing assumptions in Harland Capital's proposal. He had been working at the kitchen table Friday morning before leaving for the office and had not put it away. Diane found it that Saturday. What he saw when he came home that evening and walked through the kitchen to change before dinner was the folder exactly where he had left it, closed, with the pen balanced on top of it. He picked up the pen, put it in the drawer, put the folder in his bag, and went. A page that had been photographed and sent to a number saved in Diane's phone under the name M. Chen, which was not a person but a routing number. He would not discover this for several more weeks. By that point, the damage was already done. The week after the dinner, Kevin, we have new principal level involvement from our side, and the meeting needs to happen at a different level. Nathan kept his voice exactly where he needed it. Can you tell me what changed? We have brought in a capital partner who will have decision-making authority over this acquisition. Kevin, yes. When can we reschedule? We are targeting early next week. I will send through the contact information for the new principal, and we can coordinate through his office. The call ended. The email arrived the following morning. His assistant printed it and placed it on his desk when he arrived. He picked it. Below that, the contact information for the new principal. Marcus Reed, Chairman, Atlas Group. Nathan read the name twice, then a third time. The way you reread something when you understand it perfectly and are hoping the understanding is wrong. He set the paper down. He sat very still for a long moment, in the particular silence of a man who, Marcus Reed, the man at Aurelius, the man Serena had confirmed was the person she was with, who was also, apparently, the person who now held decision-making authority over the most important deal of Nathan Prescott's professional life. He looked at the paper on his desk for a while longer. Then he picked up his phone and pulled up the Chapter 4, the room he walked into in the 5 days between finding Marcus Reed's name on his desk and walking into Atlas Group's offices on a Tuesday morning. Nathan Prescott did the thing he always did when a situation exceeded he gathered more information. He read everything he could find about Marcus Reed. He went deep into financial. He built a picture of a man who had spent 30 years making very large decisions with very few words, who operated at an altitude where the usual tools of the trade, charm, speed, competitive energy, stopped being patience, precision, the willingness to wait until the moment when acting was correct rather than simply available. He considered once pulling granite. The deal was too far along. His reputation was too involved. You did not spend 18 months building something and walk away from it because the situation had become personally complicated. That was not a principle Nathan lived by. He went into the meeting. On the morning, she and Lily had been in and out all week, measuring walls, meeting with the contractor who was reconfiguring the layout, sitting on the floor with coffee cups, deciding where the conference table. The space was not yet what it was going to be, but it already felt like something that was becoming rather than something that was waiting. And Serena had always been good at understanding what a thing was. She had said, "Do what you need to do." He had said, "I will." She had not thought about it much since. She had things to do. She was sketching a room layout on a legal pad when Lily sat down beside her and said, without preamble, "You are annoyingly the part where your ex-boyfriend is walking into a meeting with your current boyfriend and neither of them knows the full picture yet. They are grown men in a conference room," Serena said. I trust them to conduct themselves accordingly. Lily looked at her. You are also, Serena said without looking up. Atlas Group's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Midtown, where the lobby was the kind of quiet that only expensive buildings manage to sustain, a quality of silence that does not feel like. The assistant who met Nathan on the 32nd floor was precise, pleasant, and offered nothing beyond what was needed. She brought. He stood at the window and looked at the city below and thought about how to be in this room. He had prepared for the business meeting exhaustively. He knew his numbers cold. He had anticipated every question a thorough investor would ask and had prepared answers that were complete without being defensive, which was a harder calibration than it. He was, in person, exactly what the restaurant had suggested and the Forbes profile had described, and also somehow more than either. He was a man whose sense of his own authority was so thoroughly integrated that it had stopped requiring maintenance. He moved without self-consciousness. He shook Nathan's hand with a particular. His eyes were the specific kind of attentive that belongs to people who listen to everything and conclude selectively. And when they met Nathan's, they stayed there for a second longer than social convention required, just long enough to communicate that Marcus, good to meet you, Marcus said. He said it the way people say things when they mean them neutrally. He was excellent. Whatever his limitations as a partner, a listener, a person who paid attention to the right things, none of that applied when the work was in front of him. He was sharp and specific, and he held the numbers without notes, and he answered questions completely without padding the answers with material he did not. Marcus asked about the debt structure. Nathan walked him through it. Marcus pushed on 2 assumptions in the revenue model: a compressed timeline in year 3, and a margin projection that required infrastructure spending. Nathan had footnoted, but not fully. Nathan had anticipated both and had answers that were. He made 2 brief notes on the pad in front of him, not the notes of a skeptic, but of a man who is tracking carefully. The management team came up. Nathan had opinions and gave them plainly. He said the CFO was the strongest operator on the executive team and that the CEO was a visionary with a gap in financial discipline that the CFO had been quietly. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Marcus said. Nathan told him. They spent 40 minutes on that question. It was the kind of conversation Nathan had very rarely, the kind where both people in the room are genuinely thinking, rather than performing thinking. And by the end of it, they had arrived at a framework that neither had walked in with, which was the mark Marcus. Nathan began to close his folder. There is one other matter, Marcus said. Nathan looked up. Marcus was looking at him with the same direct, unhurried attention, except that this time, the atmosphere of the room had changed slightly. The business portion of the conversation had a clear structure, and they had both been inside it. What Marcus was. Serena Cole, Marcus said. You know her. Not a question. Nathan set his folder down on the table. Yes, he said. We were together for a few years. I know, Marcus said. The silence that followed had a very specific quality. It was not hostile. It was the silence of a person who has. Nathan said, Can I ask how long you have known her? Marcus looked at him for a moment. Long enough, he said. And then, after a pause of just the right length, she is going to be fine. I want to make sure you understand that, not as a possibility. She will be fine. It was not a threat. This was something else. This was a man telling him a fact about the world, calmly, the way you state things you are certain of. There was no anger in it. There was also no opening in it, no space where Nathan could insert a counter. It was simply true, and Marcus Reed was simply saying it. Nathan found, sitting across the table, that he did not want to argue with it, that he was, in fact, relieved to hear it, in a way that surprised him, and that he chose not to examine while he was still in the room. Marcus looked at him for another moment, then he stood. which was the signal that the meeting was over, and he extended his hand across the table. "We will be in touch about next steps," he said. "The deal has merits. My team will complete there." Nathan shook his hand. He thanked him. He meant both things. He walked out through the hallway and into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he let out a breath that was longer than he had realized he was holding. His phone buzzed. "Kevin Marsh," he answered. "I am glad I caught you," Kevin said. "Harland Capital filed a formal bid this morning. Full submission, complete documentation. Their timeline for close is Q2 of next year." Nathan stood very still in the elevator. "Q2, he said. "Q2, Kevin confirmed, "which you will recognize as the same window in your internal projection model." The same. It was a working document that existed in Granite Partners' protected system, and on the printed copy he had brought home 2 weeks prior. He heard Kevin saying something else and answered in the right places, using the part of his brain that could conduct a professional conversation on autopilot while the other part was already back in his. He had left the folder. He had put the pen down on the left side of the folder. He was certain of this because he had a habit, when he put a pen down on a stack of papers, of placing it at whatever angle matched the edge of the top page. And the top page of that folder was landscape-oriented, and he had the pen he found on Saturday. The way you set it down when you have picked it up and used it and replaced it without being aware of the original position. He had noticed this and not thought about it because he had been tired and because there was always a simpler explanation. He had not moved it. He ended the call with, he stood in the cold and did the accounting. 18 months of work, the deal he had needed to close, the woman he had brought into his home, the name M. Chen in her phone, appearing in messages he had registered as a work contact and never examined. The question about the fortress, Harland Capital's bid, filed this morning, with his internal timeline down to the same month and the same contingency. The woman he had let go was carrying his child in a West Village apartment, building something he had never thought to ask about, and was going to be fine. The woman he had replaced her. He got in a cab heading downtown, and he sat in the back of it and thought about what he needed to do next, and in what order. He was not the kind of man who fell apart. What he was, right now, in the back of a cab moving south on Park Avenue, was a man who had just seen the whole picture for the first time. Every piece of, every decision he had made in the past 3 years had produced exactly this. He sat with that for the length of the cab ride. By the time he got out, he knew what he was going to do. Chapter 5. What she built. Serena was at the Chelsea office when she understood that something was going to break that day. She had been there since 7 in the morning, which was earlier than the contractor arrived, which meant she had let herself in with her own key and stood in the light came through the east windows at an angle that made the room look like what it was going to be rather than what it currently was, and she had always been good at seeing what a thing was in. She made a note on the legal pad about the positioning wall. She answered 2 emails from clients. She thought about Clara, which was what? She thought about Marcus saying, "I am not going anywhere," and about Nathan's 43-page proposal still sitting unanswered in Patricia's files, and about the way the past several months had arranged themselves into a shape that was, finally, the shape she did not know exactly what was going to happen today. But she had been watching Nathan. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, not in any specific fact, but in the aggregate of small things. She picked up the positioning document she had been revising and went back to work. Nathan got. Diane was in the kitchen when he came through the door, standing at the counter with a glass of wine and her phone, and she looked up with the uncomplicated warmth she had been producing reliably for 11 months. He set his briefcase down by the door. He took off his. Then He walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter across from her, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at people his entire life, which was directly and with the full attention of someone who is M. Chen, he said. She did not change expression. The wine glass stayed at the. He nodded slowly. And the folder I left on the kitchen counter 2 weeks ago, he said. The one with the revised Fortress model and the internal timeline memo. Page 4 had a red margin note. My pen was on the left side of the. She was quiet. It was on the right side when I came home Saturday. He watched her decide, in real time, which position to take. He had always been good at watching people decide things. You could see it happen if you were paying attention. She was very good, better than most. But he was looking at her with different eyes than he had been using for the past 11 months, and the difference was significant. I do not know what you are describing, she said. And I want you to understand that I am not asking you to confirm it. I am telling you what I know, and what I have already done with what I know. She looked at him. In the cab coming downtown this evening, he said. I sent a comprehensive account of what I believe happened to the General Counsel of Fortress Group, the compliance officer at Harland Capital's not allegations, documentation, the access pattern, the timeline discrepancy, the bid submission this. She set down the wine glass. And then something happened in the room that he had not planned for. She did not deny it. She did not reach for another angle. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not grief and not guilt, but the specific. Her composure did not break. But for the first time in 11 months, the composure was visible as a thing she was wearing rather than a thing she was. The performance had a seam, and he could see it. He held that for a moment. You made the same mistake I made, he said. You decided what I was in the first few months and never went back to check your work. She looked at him with something that he recognized, slowly and, like she was seeing him for the first time, and finding that the thing she saw was not the thing she had been looking at. Why? She said. You could have brought this to me directly, confirmed it. Instead, you sent the documentation first, because if I had asked you first, and I am tired of managing things instead of doing them. She was quiet for a while. She looked at her wine glass, and then at the counter, and then back at him. This was a job, she said. I want you to understand that. But you deserve to know that what existed between us was not entirely manufactured. I am not a person who does not feel things. I simply do not let what I feel stop me from doing what I was hired. I know, he said. And I would like you to get your things tonight, if that is possible. She did. She was efficient about it, which did not surprise him. She was out of the apartment in 45 minutes, with a bag that suggested she had been prepared for. He sat at the kitchen table while she moved through the apartment. He opened his laptop and spent 2 hours organizing the full documentation into a formal account. Carefully written, precise, and he sent it to 3 additional addresses, including the. She had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, and she looked at him with the expression of someone completing a professional evaluation, not hostile, not ashamed. Simply done, for what it is worth, she said. What I said at Aurelius about her looking good, I meant it. She always looked. She left. The door clicked shut behind her. Nathan sat in his kitchen, in the specific quiet of an apartment that has just become empty in a way that is different from ordinary silence. He closed the laptop. He sat there he slept, which surprised him, not well, but completely, which he had not done in weeks. The phone rang at 7:42 the next morning. This is Marcus Reed, the voice said. Nathan set down his coffee. I am aware that my office is not. I apologize for the unconventional approach. I wanted to speak with you directly. Of course, Nathan said. I understand that you sent documentations last evening to Fortress Group's legal team and to several regulatory addresses. I will tell you that this changes the nature of our evaluation in ways that are favorable to you and to Granite Partners. Nathan said nothing. What I called to discuss, Marcus said, is not the deal. Nathan waited. What are you going? It was the simplest question he had been asked in recent memory, and the one he had the least prepared for. He sat with it for a moment. Outside his window, the city was moving in its usual morning register, indifferent and continuous. I want to be there, in the ways that matter rather than the ways that are manageable. The line was quiet for a moment. Good, Marcus said. She has no shortage of people who are present in the convenient ways. She does not need another version of that. Nathan thought about the 43-page. He thought about the appendices. No, he said, she does not. The deal review will be completed by end of week. Marcus said, you will hear from my office. He paused. Take care of that child. He hung up. Nathan sat with his phone in his hand for a long. He knocked on Serena's door at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead, because calling ahead felt like the old version of himself, the version that managed approaches and prepared for outcomes. And he was trying to be. She opened the door he could feel her reading the situation, reading him, in the particular way she had of doing it quietly and completely. I do not have anything prepared to say, he said. I just needed to come. She stepped back and let him. She made tea, and this time when she brought the mugs, she sat not across from him, but at the corner of the table, at the angle you choose when you are having a different kind of conversation. Then he told her about Diane. He told her what he had figured out, walking through it, Chen messages he had seen and never followed up on. He told her what he had done with the documentation. He told her about Marcus's call that morning and what Marcus had said and what he had said back. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality, when he finished. She was quiet for a moment. I knew she was not what she said she was, Serena said, not specifically, but the shape of it, the way she asked questions that were slightly too targeted, the way she always seemed to know the right thing too. She paused. I watched you not see it, and I did not say anything because it was not my position to say anything, and also because I was angry, and I am not proud of that part. He looked at her. How long did you know about? Which was also about the time I understood that me telling you would accomplish nothing useful, because you would have heard it as jealousy and discarded it. She picked up her mug. I started keeping my own records instead, just in case. He sat. He was only now beginning to understand what that phrase meant, to genuinely understand it. I did not see you, he said. I thought I did. I was very certain I knew exactly who you were, and I was operating off a version of you that I. She looked at him across the corner of the table with a clear-eyed, patient assessment that had no anger in it, and no residue of the hurt that he knew was there somewhere, both of which would have been, you are very good at deciding what things are, she said. It cost you a great deal in our relationship, because you applied it to me in the first 6 months and never went back to check your work. He thought about 3 years of being certain he knew who she was. Tell me, he said, the things he could feel her deciding, as she always decided things, without hurry and without performance. Then she told him about her father, who had died when she was 19, 2 days after her birthday, from a cardiac, the kind of loss that does not allow for preparation and therefore changes permanently how you think about what can be taken from you without notice. She told him that her mother had spent 6 years after that rebuilding herself from someone who had been defined entirely by a partnership, and that watching her mother do that work, and the terror underneath that conviction of needing someone in a way that could be taken from her. She told him about Meridian Blue, how long she had been building it, quietly and alongside every other thing she was doing, a brand strategy consultancy, specializing in mid-market companies that needed a clear identity rather than a louder volume. She had her first 2 clients before she met Nathan. She had 12 clients now. She was moving. She had a business partner named Lily who had been with her from the beginning and who Nathan had met exactly once at a dinner where he had asked what Lily did and received the answer and moved on. He remembered that dinner. "I knew what you were building," he said. She shook her. He said, carefully, "I would not have asked you to be less than you were. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "I believe you believe that," she said. "And I also think that the person you were for most of our relationship asked the things you valued, the events you wanted me at, and how you wanted me to behave at them." She was not angry. She was precise. "I made myself smaller to fit the shape of the space you left for me, and I did that. But you also created the space, and you created it, assuming I would be comfortable in it." He was quiet for a long time. "I am sorry," he said, finally, "not for what I did not know. I am sorry for the things I did know, or could have known if I had." She looked at him. The morning light was moving across the table between them. "There is a difference," she said, "between a man who is sorry and a man who is different. I do not know yet which one you are." He thought about this with, "Neither do I," he said. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one, the place where smiles live when they are not yet ready to arrive. "That is probably the most honest thing you have." They sat there for another hour. They talked about Clara, about what being present actually meant as opposed to what it looked like in a 43-page document. He asked her about Meridian Blue, and she told him more than she had told him in 3 years of living alongside it. And he, when he stood to leave, she did not hug him, but at the door she said, with a directness that was entirely hers, "Come back when you are ready to actually be here, not to fix things, not to manage them, just here." He meant it in a way he had not meant things in a very long time. The Fortress investigation moved quickly once the documentation was in hand. Harlan Capital's scheme unraveled with the particular speed of a structure that Diane was removed from her firm before the month was out. The deal closed in April on modified terms, 3 months behind the original timeline. Marcus Reed's office sent a 2-paragraph letter confirming Atlas. In the final sentence, one line that was not strictly necessary for a business communication. Granite Partners conducted itself with integrity in difficult circumstances. Nathan read that sentence 4 times. He understood it for what it was, which was, he went back to Serena's apartment twice in February and twice in early March. And each time the quality of the conversation was slightly different, slightly less managed on both sides. The way things become when the effort then February came, and with it, the night Serena had been building toward for 6 years. The venue was a gallery space in the Serena had arrived an hour before the guests. She stood in the center of the room while the staff finished setting up, and she looked at the logo on the wall. Large, clean, unmistakably itself. 6 years, not as a lived thing, with the specific weight of every decision that went into the room she was standing in. The clients she had turned down because they were wrong for what she was building. The weekends spent working in the apartment, quietly, while the years she had been with Nathan, and had kept Meridian Blue in a notebook in her desk drawer because she had understood, without being told, that it would require explanation. She looked at her name on the wall and thought, I made this, not the way you think it when you understand what it actually cost. The room filled. The people who came were the people she had actually built things with, clients, collaborators, the designer who had spent 4 months understanding, the accountant who had told her 2 years ago that the numbers were ready when she was real people who had arrived in her life because of the work, not despite it. Lily found her by the window 20. You have to stop looking at the logo like it personally owes you something, Lily said. Serena laughed. The real kind. From the chest. She gave a short speech. She did not read from notes. She said that Meridian Blue was built on one conviction, that clarity of identity is not a luxury but She said it in 3 minutes, and it said everything. Marcus arrived at 8:15, during the part of the evening where people were talking and the room was warm with it. He did not come in with any. He found her near the bar, and she saw him cross the room toward her. And the specific thing she felt was not relief or pride or the satisfaction of having something to show. It was the ease of a person who has been doing hard work all evening and has just seen someone they can be. She said, I know. And he smiled at that, because she was not performing modesty, and he did not require her to. Later, when the room was thinning, she stood at the edge of the space and looked at the logo on the wall and took a photograph. Then she opened her messages and sent it to Nathan anyway, because sending it was no longer about him. It was about the fact that she was no longer carrying any of it alone. She put her phone away before a response could. The baby came on a Thursday evening in the second week of March. The contraction started at 10 in the morning, which was also the day Serena had a 3-hour client call she had to reschedule and a contractor arriving at 2. Her mother arrived at noon and looked at her daughter with the, "You should have called me 3 hours ago," her mother said. "I was finishing something," Serena said. Her mother did not argue with this because she knew her daughter. They got to the hospital at 2:30. Lily, what Serena remembered afterward, in the fragments that survive intact after that kind of day, was her mother's hand on her forearm at a specific moment, not squeezing, just there, the weight of it communicating something that did not require language. She remembered Lily making a joke at exactly the right moment, the kind only Lily would make, that was both inappropriate and precisely right. She remembered the particular quality of time in that room, which did not feel like other time, which felt both interminable and over. She was entirely, completely, undeniably here, in the specific way of people who have just entered a room for the first time and do not yet know that the room has rules. Serena held her. She had been preparing for this for 9 months, which was also in some sense 3 years, which was also in some. Her mother was crying. Lily was also crying while simultaneously claiming not to be. Serena was not crying. She was looking at her daughter with the specific, total attention of someone who has just met the most important person of their life and is taking a full accounting. She is perfect. Her mother stepped out. Lily stepped out. The nurses moved in and out with the efficient purpose of people who have witnessed this specific miracle enough times that it no longer stops them in their tracks, but who nonetheless perform their work with a care that suggests. Serena sat in the hospital bed with her daughter against her chest and thought about the 6. She thought about her father, who had not lived to see this. She thought about Marcus, who was in the waiting room down the hall, and who had said when she told him that morning that today was the day. "I will be wherever you need me and nowhere you do," she had. She thought about Nathan, who was also somewhere in this building with a coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked at her daughter's face. She thought about what she wanted Clara to understand about the world she was arriving into, about the people who had shaped it, and, she thought, she will know what it looks like when a woman builds something, because I am going to make sure of it. Then she told the nurse, "There are 2 people in the waiting room. Let them both in." Her mother came back first, then Lily, then Marcus, who crossed the room to her and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has lived enough life to understand exactly what he is looking at. He touched her daughter's hand with one finger, very lightly, and then looked at Serena. "You did this." He smiled, and the smile was the specific kind that contained something too real to be performed. And then Nathan appeared in the doorway. He stopped there. He looked at Serena first, and then at Clara, and something moved across his face that she had not seen in 3. He was just a man in a doorway looking at his daughter for the first time, and there was nothing managed about it at all. "Come meet her," Serena said. He came in. He approached the bed carefully, the way you approach something you understand. He stood beside the bed and looked at Clara for a long moment without speaking, and she could see him trying to find words, and finding that the words were insufficient and accepting that. "What is her name?" he said finally, in a voice that was quieter than she had ever heard from him. "Clara." It was real. It was the realest thing in the room. The room held all of it. The 6 years and the 3 years and the 9 months and everything that had been built and everything that had been lost and the specific, stubborn, ordinary miracle of a person who had not, a person who had no knowledge of any of it. And no, Clara June opened her eyes. They were dark and wide and completely present. The eyes of someone who has just arrived and is already paying attention. Her mother looked at her and thought, "You are going to know. I am going to make sure of it. That is the one thing I will not let anyone take from you." It was not a vow made out loud. It was simply the first decision she made as a mother. In a room that smelled of antiseptic and new beginning, with her daughter in her arms and 2 men in, she had built a company from nothing. She had raised herself from the inside out. She had chosen well, at last, the person beside her. And now there was Clara. That was enough. That was, all things considered, more than